Hi, welcome to Talking Books and Stuff, the program that talks all about books and writing and stuff. Here's your host, Dennis Rimmer.
Hello again. Welcome back. Another edition, if you want to call it that, another version of Talking Books and Writing and Stuff. I'm Dennis, your host. With us today, we have from back east in Ontario, we have Dustin Galer, and the book is Beryl. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. Beryl, The Making of a Disability Activist. So, Dustin, again, thanks for coming on with us today.
Yeah, hi. Thanks for having me.
And is that right? Beryl, that's how you pronounce the name of the person?
Yes.
Beryl.
Well, I think it's individual, but I think it's Beryl like Meryl Streep. So
Meryl
that's
Streep.
The way I pronounce it.
And Beryl, Beryl, the making of a disability activist. So the question is, right off the top, who is Beryl?
Yeah, so Beryl was born in Liverpool in the 1920s. She had a very troubled beginning to her life. She lost multiple close family members and lived through some very desperate times during the Depression and Second World War. Liverpool was one of the most bombed areas outside of London, just to give you some perspective. And trouble sort of followed her when she immigrated to Toronto in the 1950s. She was a working class mother of three. Her husband likely suffered PTSD due to his wartime experiences. There was a lot of alcoholism and abuse in the home. She had debilitating migraines at that time that first introduced her to opioids, which would become a problem for her later. They were very liberally dispensed at that time. But her life was completely transformed when a series of events led to the amputation of multiple limbs and partial vision. And her extremely long time in hospital left her with an opioid addiction that contributed to multiple suicide attempts, not to mention the devastating effect it had on her family life. But, you know, Dennis, that's just the early part of her story, because following this ordeal, she actually went on to become one of the most recognizable disability activists in Canada for a period of time. From the 1970s to the 90s, she regularly flashed across newsprint and television headlines. And that was whether she was protesting TTC's wheel trans in Toronto, shutting down Yonge Street during rush hour, or marching on Parliament Hill in Ottawa. She was almost constantly in the news for a period of time, which is why I think the book cover's image of her with a bunch of microphones in her face is probably the best image, because that's how most Canadians knew her. But when she wasn't lobbying or protesting, Beryl was in classrooms. Over the course of her career, she probably spoke to tens of thousands of students about disability issues, and I was actually one of them. I met her very briefly as a child, a story I can tell you later, when she visited my school, and it left a faint impression on me. And that's because Beryl always said children are future doctors and architects and political and business leaders, because she felt strongly if we were able to generate empathy and imprint a positive message of disability into young minds, they would carry those messages into their adult working lives and push out the fear and ignorance that she saw around her. And for her, changing minds meant changing the way we do things, and that's how it's a very long-range project of getting things done. And then it outlived her, and as you can see, if you pick up the newspaper today, it's obviously a project that continues.
And so that's how you first learned of Beryl, was a classroom visitation?
Well, actually, this book emerged out of my graduate research, which eventually became my first book working towards equity about the history of the disability rights movement. And Beryl's name kept popping up here and there, and I just couldn't quite figure her out, which as a researcher, a historian, is just so infuriating, because I need to figure out who this person was and where they stood, because she just kept appearing in different parts of the movement.
So
It wasn't until, Dennis, I discovered this picture of of her and Mr. Grizzly the Werebear. Just to back up a minute, Beryl was very inspired by children's television educators like Mr. Rogers and Mr. Dressup. So she had this sort of big plush bear as a character foil. This life-size animatronic bear with amputated limbs, used a wheelchair and spoke, all of it operated by her son Dennis, off in a corner somewhere. And this is her sort of answer to Mr. Dressup and Mr. Rogers. And seeing that image of her brought back my childhood memory of meeting her. I think she sort of looked like my grandmother, and I made this mental connection, and yet her shocking appearance, she only had one arm and one eye. As a little boy in the 80s, you don't really see that a lot. And I comment on that in the book as well. But and the more I dug into her story, it was clear to me that it had the makings of something that could be an important contribution to literature, which as an academic is sort of my standard. Because stories like hers are not inspirational fluff. They're very provocative and controversial. I mean, so many books about disability are sort of this traditional narrative arc of triumph over adversity or, against the odds.
Right.
But that's not what this book is about. I didn't know what Beryl's story was going to be. I was kind of new to biography. But the more I dug into her, I'm like, wow, this person's actually quite complicated. She had a very difficult personality. She didn't play well with others. She was ambitious. There's a lot of things that go beyond her disability, and that for me is, I think, the type of stories that we need to create now. Not the stereotype reinforcing stories about disability, but these fully formed portraits of people. And Canadians need to know more disability activists, how they shaped our history.
And like you said, she started off having scarlet fever as a youngster, and then her problems seemed to follow her the rest of her life from there, with the father leaving after he had an affair with a person at a movie theater. He got fired from his patrolman job for showing up late, and the guy said, well, you probably let the air out of your own tires. What actually, can you tell us what actually happened so that she lost those limbs and an eye? Was it a strange accident, or was it just a common slip and fall?
Yeah, so she it's funny, she sort of told her story differently to different audiences, which was, again, infuriating to me as a researcher, because I had to discover the true story. And it wasn't until I connected with her family, so her daughter Diane and granddaughter Michelle, and they were just so wonderfully generous in sharing all these parts of her story. But yeah, what essentially, I did a bit of background research in order to understand where the seeds of what happened to her may have come from. And really the culprit, or the sort of devil in Beryl's life, were blood clots, deep vein thrombosis, blood clots that block entire arteries, the movement of blood through the arteries, and then are forced to kind of splinter throughout all the spider veins. And it causes a lot of pain, and in her case led to amputations. And it was just the 6 long years in hospital where it was like amputation after amputation. And I was trying to understand where that may have come from. And so I actually consulted with some vascular surgeons and other doctors who could let me know more about, well, how scarlet fever impacts the heart, and what would have been available at the time. I'm sort of inspired by writers like Laura Hillenbrand and Stacy Schiff, who tell these wonderful narrative stories, but yet have extremely rigorous research to back up. And as a PhD in history, that's just where I love to be, in the archives. So backing up all of these really wonderful little tidbits throughout the book, I was inspired by those authors, and I love to impart that through my stories.
And the book is Beryl. It's by Dustin Galer. So how did you pitch this project to prospective publishers?
Oh, well, actually, it was like a last-ditch effort. I actually had real trouble finding a publisher for this book. I was almost ready to self-publish, frankly. It took a very long time. And since then, I've now acquired an agent, and I think things should be a bit easier from here on in. But
I hope so.
Yeah, I have to give kudos to Between the Lines. They are an activist press that Books Without Bosses is their motto, and they truly were committed to Beryl's story from the very beginning. They were, I think, inspired by, they needed more stories like disability in their portfolio of books, but also just like the strength of her story. It stands up to the test of time because she did die in 1998 and she was born in the 1920s. So this is actually we're rolling back the clock with her. But it's just such a strong, powerful story, full of sort of twists and turns as well, obviously, given what happened throughout her life, that they took a chance, and it's actually been paying off quite well. I'm very pleased to have been working with them for this.
And I like the story. Well, it's in the prologue or the preface by Judy Rebick that talks about Beryl's sort of confrontation with then Prime Minister Brian Mulroney, who Alan Fotheringham described as the jaw that walks like a man. And she sort of just buttonholed, pigeonholed, blocked him in the hallway, and he finally had to give in, so to speak, and listen to her. Can you tell us a bit more about that?
Yeah, that's the story everyone seems to be gravitating towards.
Right.
The time she maybe assaulted the Prime Minister.
Mm-hmm. You don't grab the Prime Minister by his hand, even if even in Canada.
Right. Yeah, so in the late 1980s, the Conservative government was introducing the Federal Employment Equity Bill to help address some of the obviously historic employment inequities for certain disadvantaged groups, including people with disabilities. Unfortunately, the legislation was well-intentioned but ultimately weak, according to disability activists. And that's actually a theme in most disability policy, going way back, to the 50s and beyond. Obviously, Beryl and Judy and others were not happy with the bill lacking any kind of enforceable mechanisms to ensure that employers tried to meet target. It's basically affirmative action, but they called it, Rosalie Adela called it employment equity, so that's why we call it that in Canada. So Beryl and Judy went to Ottawa to try to get a meeting with Prime Minister Mulroney to make the disability and actually Judy says it's the first time people with disabilities have led a cross social movement in Canada, which I'm not quite sure on, but it's quite possibly true. And Beryl was at the head of that. So they try to get this meeting with Prime Minister Mulroney, but they can't quite pin him down, and they get a tip-off that he uses a certain back hallway between the House of Commons and a cabinet meeting room. And so, if you intercepted him there, you could maybe get a meeting. And so that's all they intended to do. And as he comes strolling up to them, and he realizes maybe it's not a photo op, it's, these are some activists who are not happy about the bill. All of a sudden, Beryl, with her only arm, and with her one eye, she kind of squared in on him and just reached up and grabbed him and would not let go. She started screaming, you've let the disability community down. You told us you would listen to us. And you just don't grab the Prime Minister.
No.
And I don't know how long it went on, but probably everyone around was just shocked at what was happening. Certainly Judy reports that she was. And she just wouldn't let go. It wasn't even just a little grab. And eventually they got a meeting with the policy person, his top policy person. But later, when the bill was tabled without any of their demands, they organized a major protest of over 150 people with disabilities, and they marched on Parliament Hill, and Beryl even went inside and disrupted the question period in the House of Commons. So it just goes to show her sometimes very brazen style of activism. She was willing to do anything for the cause, really.
Well, that's the cover sort of demonstrates that. She's the woman, and she's pointing her finger upward, making a point to all these microphones, and the look on her face is you better listen to me, because I have a story that needs to be told. So you guys, you people with your microphones and your cameras, you better take notice of this, because it's very important. And that's kind of what I grasped from the cover. Is that what you think it is portraying?
Yeah, I think you nailed it. But, the really interesting thing about Beryl, and one thing noted by one of the documentarians of her from the 80s, is that she had this sort of old world charm I think it was maybe her Liverpool accent, her Scouse accent, and she'd wear these pearls, and she had the queenly haircut, and she even made her own clothing, very attractive blouses and everything. She adapted her sewing machine so she could make her own clothes. And so she had the ability to appear as like sort of a kindly grandmother, and she would play that role sometimes. But then she would switch and be this very defiant person screaming down the cameras about something. And people hadn't really seen that in Canada before. I mean, only a few years earlier, they were introduced to Terry Fox, which is obviously a very inspirational figure. And then here comes Beryl, and she's like angry and shouting in the camera. And so Canadians hadn't really seen that before. And I think that helped probably open some doors for others to later come along and just speak their mind.
And like you said in the book later on, she the other side of her was she liked to gamble and smoke Peter Jackson cigarettes. So she was not all doom and gloom, as it were.
No, again, this is meant to be a fully formed portrait. Yeah, Beryl was like a chain smoker. Apparently, when she ran for the Ontario Liberals in the 1990 campaign, the hardest thing for her was going door to door and not being able to smoke, because they didn't want her to smoke. So they'd have to find like a little closet somewhere where she could have a few puffs before she went to the next door. But of course, she couldn't get up to most of the doors because in the Beaches neighborhood at that time, everything was so inaccessible. She'd have her granddaughter, Michelle, run to the front door and ring on the doorbell, and sometimes get into arguments with people on the front lawn. Like she's on the sidewalk and their front door
right.
yelling at each other about political issues. So yeah, she's just quite a character.
She did run for the Liberals, and the NDP won that seat. And one would think that, well, it's stereotypical, but you'd think that a leftist, as it were, an agitator, a social demonstrator, would want to run for the NDP, but she was a Liberal.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and that's a very interesting part of her story, the political spectrum. I don't know if Beryl was so pigeonholed into party politics, but she certainly placed a lot of value on personal relationships that she built with political leaders, one of whom was former Ontario Liberal Premier David Peterson. They had a very close relationship over the years. And he had a standing offer for her to run in multiple elections that she turned down until 1990, which obviously was the Orange Wave. Yeah. Or was it Orange Crush? I can't remember. One or the other. For her, her campaign manager explained to me, because I had the same question. Why wouldn't she have, run for a party like the NDP, or run in an area in Scarborough where she was lived and was known? And it's just the nature of politics. Maybe someone else was in that riding, and well, she had this relationship that she wanted to honor, even though maybe her politics align more with the NDP. So it's just that nature of political discourse that I don't think she was very well versed in, and I guess we'll never know how she would have been in politics.
So is there a way you can sum up Beryl's lasting legacy? Why in 2022 are we talking about, I'll say somebody in the old days who made some waves in a wheelchair? Like, what can nowadays I sound so old. Things that are going on.
Younger than my dad.
Things that are going on that we don't take second thought of, like all of us. What am I getting at? Ramps at offices and sidewalks that are lowered and stuff like that. This all came about maybe because of her? No, I mean, she was certainly part of the conversation, but it's certainly like the relevance of Beryl. I mean, you could look at a television. She was always on the news, and she would do a lot of television segments. And you could look at one segment from, say, the 80s, and the topic of their conversation then is just as relevant today: accessibility, transit, affordable housing, poverty, unemployment, discrimination. Like these things have not magically gone away, and right. So they're just as relevant today as they were then. But there's really three main things I want people to take away from the book, and really that's one of them, is that we live in a very death and disability avoidant culture, but by avoiding these topics, we've really created systems that are riddled with gaps and other problems.
And Beryl spent the latter half of her life like simply trying to attract people's attention to these problems, because she knew, I mean, she sustained her accident when she was 40 years old. So she had lived well, I'm 40, so I don't know if that's middle age, but she spent a good portion of her life as an able-bodied woman, and then she experienced life as a person with a disability, and that essential juxtaposition is what motivated her to try to do something about this. Because she knew that people usually don't think about disability until it affects them directly. And so that's why she spent so much time just trying to attract people's attention to these problems. But, in a larger perspective, like this book as a biography, I just hope it helps contribute to a greater appetite for stories like hers, because we really need to know more disability activists and how they've shaped our history. I mean, they've literally shaped our built environment, our sidewalks, our culture, our language. And yet, I think for most Canadians, at least, name recognition sort of begins and ends with Terry Fox or maybe Rick Hansen.
Yep.
It's just not, we don't know David Lepofsky, Sandra Carpenter, Pat Danforth, all of these, Jim Dirksen, all of these really important Canadian activists who have really contributed a lot to our society. So I hope that people look for more stories and create more stories like this. And that the final takeaway, if I could just quickly,
Yep.
is that, Beryl bet her life's work on children. And if it's not already happening or still happening in schools, I really think that children should be exposed to positive representations of disability at a young age. And that's to nurture that empathy instead of fear that Beryl saw. She had just saw so much fear and ignorance and discrimination in adults that she turned all of her attention to children. And in her tour, she would tour all across Ontario and beyond. In her like trusty Ford van, which she made to look exactly like Terry Fox's van, because she knew people knew what that van looked like. Just to get the children in there and just, oh wow, this is, we don't have to be afraid of someone who uses a wheelchair or looks differently from us. And when you nurture empathy, that's how you achieve change. And for her, she thought it begins with children. And I quite honestly agree with her. I hope that continues.
And can the book, is that sort of what you're aiming for, is to get it available or read or by not just adults but readers of all ages, I guess?
Absolutely, yeah, because Beryl was very open about her story. In fact, she put her and was criticized by some disability activists for putting her body and her story front and center. I mean, some disability activists argued that you don't need to know my story to know that I deserve rights, which is totally understandable. But for Beryl, because she was trying to nurture that empathy, she put she knew that kids might be afraid of someone with an amputated arm, so she would draw a happy face on it and call it Mr. Stumpy and encourage them to shake it, because she had experienced people who thought she was contagious, and so they, cross the street or scream when they saw her. And so she's trying to nurture that kind of familiarity and sensitivity in a young age. And it's just, you can see if someone grows up with that perspective as opposed to fear, how that might change and have ripples throughout culture. And it's perhaps impossible to measure her true impact just because of the nature of the work that she did.
I want to thank you again, Dustin Galer, for your time today talking about Beryl. I truly hope that everybody goes out and grabs the book. The cover is arresting. They always say you can't judge a book by its cover, but in this case, I think you can. It's an interesting, compelling story, and maybe we can get together again when your next work comes out. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dennis.
Thank you for visiting with us today. This is Talking Books and Stuff with Dennis Rimmer. Contact him at dennis@talkingbooks.tk. Thank you, and may all the good news be yours. Oh, and don't forget to check out his book, The Great Canadian Notebook, available across Canada and at amazon.ca.